February 1974. Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. Henry Kissinger stepped off the plane onto scorching tarmac, 30 degrees in the shade, dark business suit, the American flag on the tail of the aircraft. Security spread out around the perimeter. The U.S. Secretary of State did not fly here as an ordinary diplomat. He flew here as a man who needed to save the global financial system, and he carried a proposal so delicate that Washington kept its contents secret for 42 years. Here are 3 facts that will change the way you understand how money works. First, from 1974 to 2024, virtually the entire global oil market operated in dollars. Not by law, not by WTO treaty, but by a single secret agreement between 2 countries. Its text was only made public in 2016. Second, by 1980, $1.2 trillion in oil money had passed through American banks. This is not a metaphor. This is a figure from the archives of the Federal Reserve, published by historian David Spiro in 1999. Third, the man who designed this scheme, William Simon, personally stood in a gas station line in 1973 like any ordinary American. 8 months later, he controlled the largest flow of capital in the history of world finance. By the end, you will understand why in 2024, Saudi Arabia quietly chose not to renew the agreement and what that means for every country that holds dollars in its reserves today. We will return to that question at the very end, but first, 1944, and one conference room where the winner took everything. Whatever world before. July 1944. A small town called Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. In the White Mount Washington Hotel, a 5-story building in the mountains that looked like a backdrop for a European novel, delegates from 44 nations had gathered. The World War was still being fought. The Normandy landings had happened just 1 month earlier. Germany was still fighting. Japan was still fighting. But the outcome was clear. The question had shifted. What would the world look like after victory? The British delegation was led by John Maynard Keynes, the most influential economist of his time, the man who rewrote the theory of government spending in the 1930s, the author of ideas that pulled Western economies out of the Great Depression. He was 60 years old, suffering from heart disease, and understood that this was most likely the last major international conference of his life. Keynes proposed creating a new international currency. He called it the Bancor. No single country would control the Bancor. No nation would gain privileges at the expense of others. If a country ran a trade surplus for too long, it would be penalized. If the trade deficit grew too large, penalized as well. The system would press on both sides of trade imbalances. No exorbitant privilege for any one nation was possible. The idea was elegant. It solved the central problem of the interwar period. Countries with large surpluses accumulated gold and did nothing with it, while deficit countries were forced to cut spending and collapsed world trade. Keynes wanted money to move, not stagnate. The American delegation was led by Harry Dexter White, a 42-year-old Treasury Department official, quiet, sharp, convinced of his own correctness. White rejected the Bancor. He pushed a simpler solution. The dollar becomes the world's reserve currency. Every country pegs its currency to the dollar. The dollar is pegged to gold at $35 per troy ounce. No limits on surpluses, no supranational currency. One country, one currency, one system. Keynes lost. White won. The reason was simple. In 1944, the United States held $26 billion in gold, more than 2/3 of the world's reserves. The British Empire had been broken by 2 wars and had run up enormous debts to Washington. Keynes could speak as eloquently as he liked, but he had no leverage. Here is the counterintuitive fact of Act 1. Harry Dexter White, the man who built dollar hegemony, was summoned before the House Un-American Activities Committee in 1948. He was accused of spying for the Soviet Union. Several Soviet defectors testified that White had passed information to Soviet intelligence. He denied everything. 3 days after being questioned by Congress, he died of a heart attack at his home in New Hampshire. The case was closed. The American financial order was created by a man the FBI considered a Soviet agent. The Bretton Woods system operated on a simple principle. The dollar is gold. At $35 per ounce, any country could walk into the U.S. Treasury and exchange dollars for real metal. This promise made the dollar more trustworthy than any other paper. World trade grew. The Japanese economic miracle, the German Wirtschaftswunder, the reconstruction of Europe under the Marshall Plan, All of this happened within the Bretton Woods framework, but the system had a flaw. The United States could print dollars, and it did. The Vietnam War cost $168 billion. Lyndon Johnson's Great Society programs added hundreds of billions more. By the late 1960s, there were more dollars in the global system than American gold could back. French President Charles de Gaulle publicly called this fraud in 1965. He ordered French dollar reserves converted to gold and sent a fleet to collect it in New York. Literally, warships docked in the New York harbor and sailed home with gold from American vaults. Others followed de Gaulle: West Germany, Switzerland, the Netherlands. By 1971, American gold reserves had fallen from $26 billion to $10 billion, yet there were $80 billion in circulation globally. The mathematics spoke for themselves. On August 15, 1971, a Sunday evening in summer, President Richard Nixon addressed the nation on television. He announced the dollar would no longer be exchangeable for gold, ever again. The Bretton Woods system was over. We covered this moment in detail in a separate video. What matters here is the consequence. The world suddenly found itself holding trillions of dollars with nothing behind them. French Finance Minister Valéry Giscard d'Estaing had already called this the exorbitant privilege of America. Print paper, and the whole world must accept it. Now that privilege hung by a thread, the dollar was sustained by confidence alone, and confidence needed backing. Mechanism of Act 1. Bretton Woods made the dollar as good as gold. When gold was removed, the system needed a new anchor. That anchor would have to be found in the desert. Ascalese. Autumn 1973. The Middle East explodes. On October 6, 1973, Yom Kippur, the Jewish Day of Atonement, Egypt and Syria attacked Israel simultaneously from two sides. The attack was carefully planned. Egyptian forces crossed the Suez Canal. Syrian tanks advanced on the Golan Heights. Israel was caught off guard. President Nixon made an immediate decision. The United States launched an airlift to Israel. Over 3 weeks, military equipment and ammunition worth $2.2 billion were delivered. Aircraft flew daily. The Arab OPEC response came 6 days later. On October 17, 1973, oil ministers of Arab states gathered in Kuwait City. Sheikh Ahmed Zaki Yamani, Saudi Arabia's oil minister, stepped to the microphone and announced a complete oil embargo against the United States, the Netherlands, Portugal, Rhodesia, and South Africa. Simultaneously, OPEC cut production by 25%. At that moment, Yamani was the most powerful oil official on the planet. He had held the ministerial post since 1962, 11 years. He had studied law in Cairo, then at New York University and Harvard Law School. He spoke English without an accent. He wore English suits. He knew Western politicians personally, and he understood the Western economy better than many Western ministers. The effect was immediate. In November 1973, the price of a barrel rose from $3 to $5.12. By January 1974, to $11.65. In some regions, the barrel reached $17. This was the sharpest oil price movement in history to that point. In the United States, chaos broke out. Gas stations imposed limits, no more than 10 gallons per customer. In Oregon, outdoor Christmas lights were banned to save energy. A 55-mile-per-hour speed limit was imposed on federal highways, partly to conserve fuel. President Nixon addressed the nation asking Americans not to light Christmas trees with electric garlands. In New Jersey, drivers got into fistfights in gas lines. In Ohio, there were shootings. In Texas, fuel distributors sold on the black market at double the price. The New York Stock Exchange lost 45% of its value over the year. U.S. GDP fell 2.5% in the fourth quarter of 1973. Inflation jumped from 3.2% to 8.7%. Germany banned driving on Sundays. Photographs of empty German autobahns in November 1973 looked like images from a parallel reality. The Netherlands introduced fuel rationing. Japan, the world's largest oil importer, fell into panic. Japanese GDP showed negative growth in 1974 for the first time since the war. Here is what was happening behind closed doors in Washington. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger understood that the oil shock was not simply an energy crisis. It was an attack on the very idea that the dollar remained necessary to the world. If countries could inflict such damage through oil, why would they bother holding dollars at all? Countries would begin diversifying their reserves. The dollar would lose its status as the primary reserve currency. And then the United States would lose the ability to finance its deficit with other people's money. Treasury Secretary William Simon stood in a gas station line in Princeton in late 1973. He later wrote in his memoirs that this was the moment when he understood the scale of the problem not as an abstraction, but physically, in his body, standing under a cold November sky in a line of 20 cars. The counterintuitive fact of Act 2. Yamani, the minister who announced the embargo, was privately opposed to oil prices that were too high. He understood that expensive oil would push the West to accelerate its search for alternatives and open up previously uneconomical reserves in the North Sea and Alaska. The Stone Age did not end because the world ran out of stones. This phrase is attributed to Yamani himself. He kept losing the argument inside OPEC, but he turned out to be right. By 1985, North Sea production had grown enough that OPEC lost its leverage. Saddam Hussein and other radical OPEC members pushed for even higher prices. Yamani held them back as best he could. By January 1974, Kissinger and Simon had agreed. A deal with Riyadh was needed. A deal that would back the dollar with oil, just as gold had backed it before 1971. We will return to this decision, but first let us understand why Saudi Arabia specifically. Mechanism of Act 2. The oil embargo exposed the vulnerability of a dollar without gold backing. The United States needed a new anchor. They had one advantage that OPEC could not buy: the largest military in the world. Here is the real problem Washington faced, and it was sharper than the lines at the gas pumps. By 1974, Saudi Arabia had suddenly become very rich. Oil revenues had grown from $2.7 billion in 1972 to $22 billion in 1974. In 2 years, eightfold. Money was arriving faster than the country could spend it. Where Riyadh chose to invest that money would determine the fate of the entire global financial system. Into German marks, the mark strengthens and German exporters suffer. Into Japanese yen, the yen rises, Japan is angry. Into gold, gold soars, confidence in the dollar collapses further. Into dollars and U.S. Treasury bonds, America gains a buyer for its debt for decades to come. The Federal Reserve can keep interest rates low. The U.S. government can finance deficits without raising taxes. This was one chance, one conversation, one flight to Riyadh. One flight to Riyadh. February 1974. Kissinger flew to Riyadh. Negotiations began with a conversation with King Faisal. In the West, King Faisal is often portrayed as a simple oil-rich manipulator. That is a caricature. Faisal had ruled Saudi Arabia since 1964 and was one of the most educated monarchs of his time. In the 1930s, he had traveled across Europe as a young prince and seen the difference between developed nations and underdeveloped ones. On coming to power, he launched a mass education program. The country had 226 schools in 1964. By 1975, it had more than 4,000. He had also abolished slavery in Saudi Arabia in 1962, despite resistance from part of the religious establishment. He built the first girls' schools, again against pressure from Orthodox clergy. Faisal personally led the oil embargo against the United States. But he simultaneously feared Soviet influence in the region far more than American influence. Nasser's Egypt was backed by Moscow. Iraq was increasingly tilting toward the USSR. Faisal saw the United States as a counterweight to the Soviet threat. He needed American military protection, simply on different terms. Kissinger understood this. That is precisely why he flew to Riyadh in person. Negotiations continued for several months, but the real mechanics of the arrangement were designed not by Kissinger, but by William Simon. Who was William Simon? He was born in Paterson, New Jersey, to an insurance family. He studied law but worked as a trader on Wall Street. At Salomon Brothers, he rose to head the trading department. In 1972, Nixon appointed him to lead the Federal Energy Office. In December 1973, Treasury Secretary. He was known for a hard character and a deep dislike of government intervention in markets. Colleagues called him William the Rock. In June 1974, Simon flew to Riyadh with a concrete scheme. His team had worked for months. Lawyers, financiers, diplomats. They structured the agreement so that it would not appear anywhere as an official interstate treaty. Bloomberg was only able to publish documents about this deal in 2016. The essence of the agreement fits into 3 points. First, Saudi Arabia prices oil exclusively in dollars. Other OPEC member states of the Gulf Cooperation Council follow this model. Second, oil revenues, hundreds of billions, are invested in U.S. government bonds through a special channel, not through the Treasury's public auctions, but through a separate hidden account. No other holder of U.S. Treasuries had such a privilege. This meant Saudi purchases did not appear in public statistics and did not affect auction prices. Third, the United States guarantees the military protection of the kingdom, weapons supplies, military advisors, permanent U.S. naval presence in the Persian Gulf. Washington agreed to complete secrecy. That is precisely why we did not know about this for 42 years. The mechanism this deal set in motion, economists call it petrodollar recycling. Here is how it works. Japan buys Saudi oil, pays in dollars. Saudi Arabia receives dollars, invests in U.S. treasuries. The United States gets the money back and finances its budget deficit. Japan holds dollars as a reserve because oil is only sold in dollars. The loop is closed. This means one thing. Demand for dollars is built into the very mechanics of global energy trade. Every country that wants to buy oil, and that is virtually every country on Earth, must first buy dollars. Other OPEC members saw the Saudi model. Kuwait joined the scheme in 1974, the UAE in 1975, Qatar in 1976. Nigeria and Venezuela kept oil revenues in dollar-denominated instruments. The petrodollar became the de facto standard of world trade without a single United Nations vote. The counterintuitive fact of Act 3, Simon deliberately structured the deal as an informal arrangement. An official treaty would have required Senate ratification, votes, debates, publicity. An informal agreement required only the will of two people. That is why the U.S. Congress learned the details of the deal from Bloomberg, from a newspaper, not from official documents. Mechanism of Act 3. Petrodollar recycling created structural demand for the dollar. The world now held dollars not because it trusted gold, but because it could not buy energy otherwise. By 1977, Saudi Arabia held $20 billion in U.S. government bonds. By 1980, $1.2 trillion in oil money had passed through the American banking system. By 1985, combined OPEC investments in American assets exceeded $500 billion annually. But the implications went beyond the Gulf states' money alone. Look at how the system worked at scale. South Korea in the 1970s was building its industrial base. It needed steel. Steel required coal and oil. Oil was bought in dollars. South Korea had to earn dollars by exporting to the United States. The American market absorbed Korean goods. Korea received dollars and bought oil again. The United States ran a permanent trade deficit, but it was financed by petrodollars returning through Korean bonds and direct investment. Brazil in the 1970s was building highways and factories, loans in dollars, debt service in dollars, oil in dollars. Brazil was forced to accumulate dollars at any cost, even at the cost of suppressing domestic consumption. By 1982, Brazil's debt reached $91 billion, and the country declared default. This was the first Latin American debt crisis. Its cause was partly that global banks lent petrodollars to developing countries generously and indiscriminately. India paid for oil with up to 30% of its export income in the 1970s. The oil shock literally halted Indian industrialization for several years. Now the people. William Simon left government in 1976. He wrote a book called A Time for Truth, a critique of government intervention in the economy. The book became a bestseller. He then founded an investment firm and by 1987 had made $300 million through leveraged buyouts. The man who built the petrodollar system used its logic, leverage, debt, structured arrangements to build personal wealth. He died in 2000. The Wall Street Journal's obituary called him the most influential Treasury Secretary since Alexander Hamilton. King Faisal did not live to see the consequences of the deal. On March 25, 1975, he was receiving official visitors at his palace in Riyadh. During the audience, his nephew, Prince Faisal bin Musaid, approached and shot him at point-blank range. The king died of his wounds. The nephew was captured and executed several months later. The official version, personal motives. A number of journalists and researchers pointed in subsequent years to the fact that the assassin had spent several years in the United States and had contacts with left-wing organizations. The CIA investigated the case for several years and published no conclusions, perhaps because there were none, perhaps for other reasons. Henry Kissinger lived to be 100 years old. He died in November 2023. He gave interviews until the end, wrote books, spoke at conferences. He never spoke publicly about the details of the petrodollar agreement. When Bloomberg published the documents in 2016, Kissinger offered no comment. Yamani, the minister who announced the embargo, was dismissed by King Fahd in 1986, without warning and without explanation, a phone call. You are no longer minister. The reason? In 1985-1986, Saudi Arabia sharply increased oil production to crash prices and deal a blow to the Soviet economy, the main Cold War rival. Yamani opposed the sharp production increase. Fahd decided otherwise. Oil fell from $28 to $10 per barrel. The Soviet budget collapsed. Yamani lost the internal argument again, and again he turned out to be right. Prices fell so sharply that all producers suffered. The counterintuitive fact of Act-4, the principal beneficiary of the petrodollar system was not the American gasoline consumer. The principal beneficiary was the American bond market, and through it a government that could borrow more cheaply than any other on the planet. This financed not just military budgets but social programs, infrastructure, and scientific research. The United States lived in permanent deficit and never settled the bill because the world kept buying its debt. There is a detail rarely discussed. Countries that attempted to trade oil outside the dollar system faced American pressure. Saddam Hussein in 2000 converted Iraq's oil sales under the UN Oil for Food program to euros. The Iraq War began in 2003. The first thing American forces did upon entering Baghdad was convert Iraq's oil accounts back to dollars. This is documented. Muammar Gaddafi in 2009-2010 actively promoted the idea of a pan-African gold currency, a gold dinar, for trading oil and gas among African nations. Hillary Clinton's emails released in 2016 showed this idea was viewed in Washington as a serious threat. In 2011, NATO began the intervention in Libya. Gaddafi was killed. This does not mean the petrodollar was the only cause of these wars. Both conflicts had many other factors, but the correlation is noted not only by conspiracy theorists. It is cited by David Spiro in his 1999 monograph and by Rachel Bronson in her 2006 academic work. Mechanism of Act-4. The petrodollar system created a structure in which deviation from the dollar in oil trading was perceived as a threat to American national interests. This transformed a financial architecture into a geopolitical instrument. In June 2024, the 50-year term of the U.S.-Saudi petrodollar agreement expired. Saudi Arabia did not renew it. No press conferences, no official statements. Bloomberg reported it briefly, and most outlets did not follow. Quietly, just as the deal itself was quietly concluded in 1974. But the data shows what is happening. According to the IMF, the dollar's share of global currency reserves has fallen from 72% in 2001 to 56.9% in the third quarter of 2025, the lowest level since 1995. The IMF notes that 92% of the mid-2025 quarterly decline is explained by exchange rate effects. The dollar weakening makes non-dollar reserves appear larger. No mass dollar sell-off has occurred yet. China has reduced its holdings of U.S. Treasuries from $1.3 trillion in 2013 to $682 billion by November 2025. Russia has abandoned dollar reserves entirely since 2022 when the West froze $300 billion in Russian assets. Central banks worldwide have purchased more than 1,000 metric tons of gold annually for 3 consecutive years. The gold price reached $3,500 per ounce in May 2025, an all-time record. In 1974, when the petrodollar system was being launched, gold cost $175. In oil trade, China and Russia have been trading oil in yuan since 2022. In 2023, Saudi Arabia sold a batch of oil in yuan to Chinese state company CNOOS, the first time in history. India has been paying for Russian oil in rupees and dirhams since 2022. Iran trades oil with China through swap agreements bypassing SWIFT. The UAE is actively developing dirham-denominated settlements. This is not the end of the dollar. Approximately 80% of global oil trade still flows through dollars. Network effects are enormous. All banks, all swap desks, all contracts are historically tied to the dollar. This does not change in a year or two, but the direction of the shift is visible. BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, has been discussing a common settlement unit since 2023, not a replacement for the dollar but an alternative instrument for mutual trade. In August 2023, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Ethiopia, Egypt, and Argentina joined BRICS, 9 countries, the largest bloc of oil producers. The European Central Bank under Christine Lagarde in 2025 spoke of a global euro moment, the possibility of strengthening the euro's role in international settlements. This is the first time since 2008 the ECB has openly set such a goal. For scale, the transition from the British pound to the dollar as the world's reserve currency took 30 years, from 1914 to 1944, and that was despite the British Empire losing 2 world wars and half its colonies. No one today is at war with the United States. No one is publicly abandoning the dollar. They are simply, quietly, deal by deal, moving part of the world's oil trade outside the dollar system. One final number to understand the stakes. In 1974, when William Simon was building the petrodollar system, U.S. national debt stood at $484 billion. In 2026, it has exceeded $36 trillion, a 74-fold increase in 50 years. That debt was financed by a world that was structurally compelled to hold dollars in order to buy oil. If demand for dollars begins to structurally decline, the United States will either have to cut its deficit or pay more to borrow. Both options are painful, especially when the debt is $36 trillion and interest payments have become the largest line item in the federal budget. In 1944, Keynes proposed a neutral international currency, the Bancor, controlled by no single nation. He was rejected. The United States chose a system in which its own currency became the global standard. For 50 years it worked. It financed the American deficit. It kept oil prices in dollars. It gave Washington leverage over any country that needed energy. Now the system is weakening. The question is not whether the dollar will die as a reserve currency. The question is what comes next. The yuan, a currency from a country with a closed capital account, where the government controls the exchange rate. The euro, the currency of a bloc without unified fiscal policy. Gold, of which there is physically not enough for the volume of world trade. Central bank digital currencies, which currently have neither the trust nor the infrastructure, or something that does not yet exist. John Maynard Keynes died in April 1946, 2 years after his Bancor was rejected at Bretton Woods. He did not live to see either the dawn or the sunset of the system that defeated his idea. Sometimes the losers turn out to be right. They are simply too early.